Okay, so for those of you who might not know, I'm Michelle, I'm the vicar here at St John's, and it's our real delight to welcome you here tonight and to join together for this wonderful talk that we're about to hear from Charlie. Charlie, it's very, very good to welcome you here. As an inclusive church, we are so glad to be able to host this event on behalf of Peterborough Pride. And I'm going to hand over now to Vicky Brett, who's going to say a little bit more about what is happening tonight and to introduce Charlie properly to you all. So lovely to see you, and we'll catch up a bit at the end, I'm sure. Vicky.
So on Saturday, over 1,000 people marched through the centre of Peterborough, banging drums, shaking tambourines, playing music, whilst decked out with rainbows and flags and glitter. They called for equality, for freedom to hold hands in the street without abuse, and for acceptance. There were two groups of Christians also out on Saturday. The first group stood at the side of the road, shouting at the marchers, telling them they were evil and going to hell. One of them even spat at the marchers. The second group of Christians, and some of them are here today, marched with the parade, some as gay Christians, some as supporters, some as stewards keeping them safe. And at the green backyard, where the parade finished and the celebration started, they handed out 3 bottles of water to the overheated marchers. They handed out sweeties and treats. They prayed with people. They invited people here into the Pride service at St Mary's, and they showed God's love. Which group do you think Jesus would be in? As the Pride Festival comes to a close tonight, we have a special treat. The Reverend Charlie Bell has come to talk about his new book, Queer Holiness. We have a few copies for sale at the back, but the first printing has sold out. So get in quick and get Charlie to sign it for you while he's here. You could also buy a Kindle version on Amazon or wait for the reprinting in a few weeks. Some of us know Baroness Ruth Hunt, the former CEO of Stonewall. She managed to get a copy, and she says this book is a must-read for anyone interested in putting people at the heart of the Christian faith. Charlie is not just a priest, he's also a bit of a brain box. He's an academic clinical fellow in psychiatry at South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, and also the John Marks Fellow, college lecturer and director of studies in medicine at Girton College, Cambridge. I hope I got that right. Charlie.
Well, thanks very much indeed for the introduction, and it's really lovely to be here. The one job I will mention also is that a couple of years ago I worked for Hugh Yardley, who's with us this evening, in the House of Commons for the Health and Social Care Committee Secretariat. And it's lovely to see Hugh here, and his wife Fiona with him as well. So thank you both for coming this evening. I thought this evening what I'd do was give a bit of an overview as to why I wrote the book in the first place. And then a little bit of an overview about what the book says, and then possibly reflect a little on what's happened in recent weeks, both with the Lambeth Conference and looking forward to what might change in the Church of England. And I should say from the start that I am a Church of England priest, still new priest. I keep saying deacon. I'm not a deacon anymore, I'm now a priest, which is a surprise to many, including those who asked the Bishop of Southwark not to ordain me, partially as a result of this book. So I am a Church of England priest, so I'll speak pretty unashamedly from a Church of England perspective. But there are many, many shared elements to that, and I know that people here this evening will be from different church traditions, but nonetheless, hopefully there's something useful or interesting from the Church of England's perspective for people to think about. I think it's important too to think from a church perspective about the Church of England as the established church. So an example being that you can get married if you haven't been married to someone before or not currently married to someone. You can get married without exception in your parish in this country, provided the person is someone of the other sex, the opposite sex, or opposite gender, depending on which terminology you want to use. So that's important because what the Church of England has done as a church has made it very clear that that open to all attitude is now shut, specifically for same-sex couples. And so whether you're a Church of England member or not, I think it's worth being aware that that does have an impact on you and on your relationship, particularly if you're not straight, but just in general across the country, the Church of England has made a specific and deliberate decision to exclude. I mention that also because if you look on the Church of England's website, shiny and lovely though it is, there is a wonderful little phrase which says, "Unfortunately, we are unable to marry people of the same sex." The unfortunately is doing a lot of heavy lifting. The unfortunately relates to the Church of England's own lobbying to ensure that they would not be able to marry two people of the same sex. So the unfortunately lies entirely at the door of the bishops, or certainly of those in authority in the Church of England. So we are unfortunately unable to marry people of the same sex, and I'd like to talk a bit about marriage today. But I don't think marriage is the whole thing. There's a lot more to the Church's engagement with LGBTQI people than marriage. So that's one little sort of introduction. The other thing I think it's worth reflecting on is the importance of hospitality as a Christian virtue. So we heard a little bit earlier about two very different forms of engaging with Pride March. And for me, hospitality sits at the heart of what the Christian faith is. And so when we talk about marriage, we are talking about a particular institution that may come with a whole host of different understandings, different ecclesial theologies and so on. But at the heart of this all, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about people, we're talking about hospitality of churches and in churches. So we often hear about the church and LGBTQI people, not the LGBTQI people who are part of the church itself. So I think it's worth trying to look at the question of LGBTQI people, and hence queer holiness, in the context of what it tells us about the church itself. What does it say about hospitality which we are or are not offering to others? So, and my final sort of precursor is that the subtitle of the book has come in for some criticism, and I'm very happy to take criticism, as Hugh will tell you. And the criticism is valid, because the book doesn't necessarily talk in huge details, or at least doesn't spell out in huge amounts of detail what the specific gift of LGBTQI people is to the church. That's something perhaps that we could think about during the discussion afterwards, and I plan to speak for a short while and then open up to questions and discussion. But I hope that one of the things which the book elucidates and tries to describe is why it matters that LGBTQI people are not only included but also listened to, and also the remarkable staying power of folk who have spent far too long being at best second best, and often being the active target of abuse and hostility. So in a sense, one of the gifts of LGBTQI people is just being here. And we had an interesting discussion amongst some Southwark clergy, which is my diocese, a few weeks ago. We talked about what would happen and the outcomes of the listening process currently going down in the Church of England. And one person said, well, what happens if we decided that all LGBTQI clergy would need to be sacked? Southwark Diocese would be in trouble. But not just Southwark Diocese, an awful lot of other dioceses as well, and dare I say the House of Bishops too. We would be in trouble. So one of the key things that LGBTQI people have done to the church is kept it going, kept the wheels on the road. The same has often been true when different groups have been discussed. When we talked about women's inclusion in the clergy, the people who've been keeping the Church of England on the road, in many cases, have been the women who've been denied ordination. And in this case, LGBTQI people are still there. And it's not just about ordination, but it's important to remember that there are still barriers, significant barriers, to people who are in same-sex relationships who happen to be clergy. So with all of that said, I'd like to talk in three key areas this evening. The title of the talk is Loving God and Loving Each Other. And one of the big myths I'd like to really put aside tonight is that those two things are in any way in tension. But if you read some of the material from the Church of England in a recent course called Living in love and faith, you'd perhaps at least be forgiven for believing that there might be a tension between them. Living in love and faith, for those of you who don't know about it, and I envy you, living in love and faith is a process well, it wasn't officially a process initially, it was an opportunity to learn and engage together with people of different understandings, theological backgrounds, church backgrounds and the rest of it within the Church of England, to try to get an understanding as to where we're all coming from and where we might be going. It was released in response to the refusal of the House of Clergy, the clergy that represent the clergy of the different dioceses, to accept a statement from the bishops in around, I think, 2018, although someone else may correct me, I'm afraid I haven't got the date right in front of me. When the bishops stated, in response to yet another listening process about LGBTQI people, they said, yes, we feel that we should be nicer, but much more of the same, really. And no change to doctrine, no change to the ability to bless people, and in fact, a stronger codifying opposition to any blessing of same-sex couples. And the House of Clergy said thanks but no thanks, and refused to take note, which is Church of England speak for sort of throwing something in the dustbin, or at least refusing to acknowledge it. So the bishop said, fine, okay, we'll go away and do our homework again, and they went away and did their homework again, and living in love and faith, which you'll hear referred to a number of times and is referenced in the book, was the kind of brainchild of this process. So Living in Love and Faith was produced, and it has been going on for a large number of months now, and we're slowly but surely nominally coming to the end of this engagement listening process. As I've said, it's not the first. Many people would hope it might be at least the beginning of the end. And it's opposite time-wise, because the bishops of the entire College of Bishops, so all of the bishops of the Church of England currently acting as bishops, will be meeting in September for the first of their meetings to discuss the outcomes that they have learned in their own discussions and that have been reported back from parishes about living in love and faith and where we go from now on. The mood music has very much moved from being a listening process to a process of discernment, which many of us would hope leads to something happening. What that something will be, I'll return to at the end of the talk. So, I want to talk a little bit about three things. Firstly, I want to talk about the theology and where the theology of this book comes from. I'm not going to attempt to or give a great in-depth theological lecture. Neither am I particularly qualified to do so, and neither are you probably here to listen to one, so we'll avoid that. But I'll talk a little bit about the premise and the understanding and the reasons that the theology is as it is in this book. I'll talk a little bit about where we are as the Church of England now, and the insights, the psychological and other insights from this book and how that reflects on where we are now as a church. And I also want to talk a little bit about the future, the challenges and hopes for the future. So, I wrote this book principally not because I thought I had anything radical and new to say, which will not come as a surprise to anybody here. And in fact, one of the problems with talks about LGBTQI inclusion in the church is that the people that often come to those talks are the people for whom this is already pretty self-evident. People say, well, I know, so what are we going to do about it? Fair enough. And I hold my hands up and say that I have not had some radical new revelation or even a visitation by the Blessed Mother. Nothing like that has happened, I'm afraid. I have simply tried to distill everything that I've thought about this, and other people have taught me about this over the years, into a book which is able to be, at least to some degree, comprehensive of the outline of the issues and arguments, if not comprehensive of the issues and the arguments themselves. And the book has a lot of places to go if you want to do more further reading and discussion about that. The other reason I wrote the book is because there is one area which I don't think has been properly discussed, and that is the science and the psychology element of same-sex relationships and its impact on the church. And that's what this book really seeks to do. It seeks to take what we know as a starting point. And much church discussion on same-sex issues, same-sex marriage and the rest of it, starts from the wrong place. Now, I can already hear one particular person, but I can hear many people saying in my ear, now, That's fine, but science is political too. Science is ideological. And of course there are elements of science which are ideological. There are elements of social science in particular which have ideological elements to them. However, science does have the benefit of evidence on its side. And one of the key things which we need to do as Christians, I think, not just in sexuality but more widely, as even the Lambeth Conference recognised, is to see science and human discovery as ultimately part of the gift of God, rather than in opposition to the gift of God. We shouldn't see it as a negative challenge, we should see it as a positive challenge. I gave an interview to the Church, well, I sort of gave an interview to the Church Times a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things which I said in that interview, which I think is really apposite for this book, is, so I work as a psychiatrist, and I work now with some very, on the sort of psychopathic side of psychiatry, really very severe and enduring mental illness, which is often associated with violence and similar. For me, if my theology doesn't cope with that, if my theology is unable to engage with people who are struggling on the very edges of society, both in terms of the way that society treats them and the way that they're engaging with society themselves, then I don't think that my theology has any value whatsoever. So for me, I think it's absolutely key that we're able to engage our theology with everything and with the world as it is. So for me, the key thing that science can give us in recent decades is an understanding of how the world is. So, simple example, lots of people in the debates on sexuality will talk about X and Y chromosomes. So, you have two X chromosomes, you're biologically female. You have XY chromosomes, you're biologically male. False. Simply false in terms of the basic underlying biology. What actually is involved is a complex interplay between different sex organs in the body, hormones, and a particular region on your Y chromosome, which is called the SRY region, which is essentially a protein that's produced that enables you to become, or causes the body to deviate from the normal, which, by the way, is the female anatomy, towards the male. That's what happens. It's just a fact. It's not ideological, it's factual. That's what happens. At the moment, we are still debating as though we don't know that information, amongst a whole host of other different things that we're learning. We're taking our theology from a dogmatic position about what we understand about the world. And that, for me, is not how we should be doing our theology. We should be dealing with what we know is the case. And we should also be able to engage our theology with what we don't know. So there are many things that we still don't fully understand. We don't fully understand, for example, the sex differences in the brain. So if we don't know this, then we need to be very careful about making absolute assertions about things which themselves may be falsifiable. In my book, I've talked about evolution being one of these key examples. If the church, which some elements did, tie everything that they have to an understanding of the development of human nature and humankind, if they tie it to one particular creationist narrative, and over time that becomes less and less and less believable, and more absurd, we get to the stage where the faith itself becomes associated with that absurdity. So for me, it is absolutely essential, not that we throw everything out, and not that we immediately say, well, you know, science says this, so we have to throw out our theology, but that each time we refine our theology to engage with nature as we know it. That's not the same as natural theology, which we can talk about in the discussion if we want, but it's about saying we need to talk about what is, not about what we wish was. So that's my first point. So in this book, one of the first two of the first chapters are called So You Don't Believe in the Bible. And the reason I called them this is because that, I think, is the most annoying sentence anyone has ever said to me. I think. There are many to choose from, but it's up there. It's certainly in the top 5. My partner Peter's here. I think actually the number 1 is, would you pay for this? But I think it's up there in the top 5, and I'm sure he probably feels exactly the same way from me. So in my top 5 sentences of frustration is, so you don't believe in the Bible. And that is the constant refrain to those of us who believe honesty, having grappled with biblical texts, having grappled with the wider world, the science and the rest of it, and come to a different perspective to those who say that the Bible is clear on a particular topic. My view is that the Bible is clear, but not necessarily in the same way that other people might say it's clear. And that's fine. I don't deny that other people come to a different perspective, but I do find that other people deny that I come to mine, and many of you here may come to the same issue. Now, I'm not going to prove text. I'm not going to go through the Bible and say, and I don't do this book because I think it's pointless. So I'm not going to go and find all those texts which talk about homosexual activity, if they talk about homosexual activity, and say how awful they are or how they actually mean this or whatever. That work can be done, and it's interesting work, and it's important work, and it's for biblical scholars to do. I don't think the texts, speaking personally, I don't think the texts are as clear as are often described, but that's a work of biblical scholarship. What I'm saying is that when we reach a text, or when we reach an understanding of human nature that we need to engage with a text, what do we do? And I think there are three essential ways of engaging with Scripture in this way. One of them is saying, that text is clearly wrong. So the first thing you say is, I am going to bin this text, because I don't think that part of the Bible is right. I think it's wrong. Now, I think there's probably some strong arguments for doing some of that, some of the time. But I'm not sure that's what I'm doing when we come to sexuality. But I think there are elements that we could discuss later, perhaps, where there are elements of the Bible which, and if those of you who do the daily office will occasionally come across slightly challenging, out of context texts that you read and you think, oh my goodness, that's this morning's reading, lovely, which you then quickly skirt over and move to the next part. But there are questions about what we mean when we say the Bible is wrong. And we'll return to that in the third way of thinking about the Bible. But one thing we can just say is it's wrong. The other thing we can say is the Bible is absolutely clear on absolutely everything. Tough. So ignore everything that we know. Ignore everything about sexuality, ignore everything about human nature, ignore everything about human flourishing, ignore the human sciences. All of that doesn't matter if the Bible says a particular thing. So we can either say the Bible is wrong, or we can say the Bible is right. And those two are often presented as the only two alternatives. It's wrong, it's just nonsense, or it's right, and therefore everything else is nonsense. Or we must be mistaken. Or, and this is what I've tried to do in this text, we can say, let's reinterpret or reinterrogate and refine what we're reading when we're reading the Bible. Let's read the Bible through the eyes of what we know about the world. Back to what I was saying about science, reading the Bible from a perspective of dealing with what is, rather than what we wish there were. Now, in this book, I think I make a fairly strong case for that third perspective, but it's a perspective for which we constantly need to fight. It's a perspective which is constantly being held up as, so you're saying the Bible's wrong. And there's a difference between throwing the Bible out and saying, actually the Bible doesn't matter at all, and saying the Bible is a group of texts written at a particular time, in a particular context, to particular people. They all have slightly different, well, they have very different authorship. The authorship of them all is not entirely clear. The way that they were written is not entirely clear. Their genre is different. There are prophets that are writing. There is wisdom literature. There's the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. So all of these different forms of biblical writing are there. They're all important, and they are all nourishing to some degree. Although again, back to our morning prayer, evening prayer discussion, sometimes some are more nourishing than others, but they're all there. So we can't ignore them. And we've got to have an intelligent way of grappling with them. And I think one of the key things we need to do as we move forward as a church, not just on sexuality issues, but also on issues of disability, and on issues of racial justice and so on, is to actually keep refining our doctrine and keep reinterrogating the texts with what we know rather than what we wish. So a good example that I've been reading recently was looking at how and why and whether people should exercise ordained ministry in the church if they have a disability. And I haven't got time to go into it in a huge amount of detail, but given that there are lots of people here from Inclusive Church, it's worth possibly thinking about. There's huge historical precedent for excluding people with particular disabilities from ministry in the church. That's just the reality of the situation. And if we do not reinterrogate and refine our understanding of why the Bible's saying what it's saying, when it's saying, and to whom, then we end up back in that place where we just simply say, well, the church has always done it this way, so we should do it that way. As time has changed, we are beginning to recognise that that is no longer appropriate. Similarly with various slavery texts and similar. The question that comes to me time and time again is why we're not willing to do the same work with people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. Why are we unwilling still to engage with the disability questions to the degree that we should? Why are we still refusing to engage with issues of racial justice in the way we should? And why are we still refusing to engage with texts as they relate to LGBTQI people? So I think the Bible is ultimately a narrative, or a group of narratives that speak of human flourishing. And I think we can talk about human flourishing from a purely biblical view, and we can talk of human flourishing from everything else we know about the world, whether that's the social sciences, science, art, culture, the rest of it. And I don't think that those two things need to disagree with one another. They're not in contrast with one another. One of the key reasons I think that's the case, and I touch on this in the beginning of the book, is my understanding of human relationship and the importance of relationship in the scriptures. To me, the Bible is, at its heart, a discussion of relationship. It's a discussion of relationship between people, it's a discussion of relationship between God and his chosen people, and between God and the whole of creation. That seems to be what is ultimately being told in the Bible. It's about good relationship, it's about what right relationship looks like, and it's also, in a large number of places, about what wrong relationship looks like, and what the outcome of wrong relationship looks like. So, in a sense, it's a love story, it's a narrative, it's about relationship. And what we risk doing when we try to turn that relationship into who does what, where, and when, we end up moving away from the core, which is the relationship, towards the peripheries, which is the what, who, why, and how. And for me, our focus on the Bible as a group of texts that tell us who does what with when, or who does what with what when, rather than talking about the innate qualities of relationship, seems to me to be our first bad turn. So, for example, in the final couple of chapters of the book, I look at marriage and the Eucharist. For me, marriage is, I think, central to where we go as a church with same-sex relationships. I think, and people will disagree with me, but I don't think marriage is the be-all and end-all. I don't think that will solve everything overnight. But I think it will, it does nonetheless get to the heart of what we mean when we talk about good relationship. And for me, sex is part of good relationship. Now, we can have a debate until the cows come home, which, by the way, we're not going to have, about whether sex is ever outside of good relationship, which we know it is in certain cases of kind of devastating abuse and so on, but also whether sex is inevitably and intrinsically only good when in relationship. But the thing I want to think about is the importance of relational sexuality. And I talk about that a number of times in the beginning of this book. For me, sex within the relationship between two consenting adults is part of the relationality. It's not separable from the relationality. When I was at university, I was really irritated when I was at university, and I used to send irritating emails to clerics to try and tear apart their sermons, which, praise God, no one has yet done to me, but I'm sure they will. And one of the things which I used to find really confusing, genuinely confusing, was what people meant by sex. So I wrote to one of our more conservative clergy in the town, having heard him preach in the Cambridge City Mission, which is about as fun as it sounds. And it was a sermon called something like "Sex is Only for Marriage" or something, some real sort of zinger at the title. And I said to him, "What do you mean?" He said, "What do you know?" I said, "What do you mean by sex?" "Well, you know, it's pretty obvious, isn't it?" I said, "Is it? I wouldn't be asking the question if it was pretty obvious. What do you mean by sex?" Well, you know, it's when, and then we went through this long email exchange, which I still have hidden somewhere. And at the end, the answer was, well, it's something you wouldn't do with a friend, isn't it? I thought, you don't know the students of Cambridge, sunshine. But it's interesting, because actually, when we're trying to get to the heart of what we mean by sex, we actually do come up with a bit of a difficulty. Now, we could say sex means, now excuse me those of you of a gentle disposition, but you know, we could talk about sex as being vaginal sex, fine, you know, male, female, vaginal sex. So that's one definition of sex. But if that's what you call sex, then everything outside of that is no longer sex. So therefore everything outside of that is no longer only for marriage. So that can't be the case, because we know that that is not what the church has taught. So then we say, well, where does it end? Heavy petting? And of course, sex is entirely cultural, or at least to a large degree. There's elements outside of what might be thought of penetrative sex. A lot of that is very culturally mediated. So holding hands with someone in certain cultures would be seen as a sexual act, an inevitably sexual act. And indeed, you know, you can get spat on for doing so. You can get beaten up for doing so in certain parts of the world still. You could probably get arrested for doing so in certain parts of the world. Indeed, in certain parts of the Anglican Communion, you could still get arrested for doing so. And in some cases, that would be supported by bishops of the Anglican Communion. But that's another story for another day. So, in some cases, it's very clearly sexual. But in other parts of the world, it's very clearly not sexual. Two people of the same sex holding hands, walking down the street is entirely normal. So we've hit the cultural rather than the biological. We've hit a very challenging question, which is, what is sex? And I still, I'm afraid, have not heard anyone give me an effective definition of what sex is, or rather what sex isn't. So that grey area for me seems to be important. I suppose the time when we know something is sexual and when we don't know something is sexual is when we're in relationship. We know what's crossing the line. And in many ways, that's why I think sex and relationship are inherently and inevitably drawn up with one another. Because we know when something is moving into the sexual rather than the purely friendship or the purely platonic or the purely sensual. But we know it because of the context within which we find it, and that context is almost inevitably relational, if not relationship. So for me, relational sexuality is what we're talking about when we're talking about the sexual expression within marriage, the sexual expression within relationships. If we start there, and we talk about relational sexuality, then we must be clear that when we say that same-sex, so I almost used the trope myself, sorry, I was going to say same-sex attracted people. It goes to show how many talks I've done and how many times I've heard that phrase thrown back at me. People who are attracted to some of the same-sex, LGBTQI folk, in the main. When we say to them, when we say to us, when we say to people, you cannot have sex with one another, or rather, you cannot get married, and of course the argument being marriage and sex equal the same thing, so therefore you can't get married means you can't have sex. When we say you can't have marriage, we're not just saying you can't have penetrative sex. We're saying you may not, you should not, God forbids you to have relational sexuality with someone else. For me, that is an astoundingly strong position to take. Really strong position for us to take. Because it's not talking about sex acts. It's not, again, talking about what goes where and when. It's talking about relationship. It's actually a strong statement saying your relationship with someone else must be by nature and character different than someone who is attracted to someone of the opposite sex. That for me is a very, very challenging place for the church to find itself. But that is the inevitable outcome of our current position, and one which I think we need to do a lot more thinking about, rather than simply going back to what the Bible says sex is for marriage only, so and so on. So what do we mean when we say sex, I think, is one of the key questions which we haven't done justice to. One argument made frequently about scripture and sexuality is the argument from Genesis. And it's worth just rehearsing it very briefly because I've heard it a large number of times and it's usually brought out as the gotcha to try and sort of get me at the end of the lecture, well, that's all very well, but, you know, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Which, I mean, honestly, it's just unbelievable. You wouldn't believe that people still use that kind of trope, but people do. People say that, and you think, that's not clever. You know, like, as though I've never heard that before. Anyway, so people come out with this sort of stuff. And if I'm trying to be generous to them, which I do try, and I often fail, the argument is essentially that God made man and Garden of Eden and brought woman out of them to be his companion, and then Jesus talks about that man and wife become one flesh, and therefore Jesus' teaching on marriage is that it's between one man and one woman. I mean, there's a lot of sort of logical, lies along the way, but that's ultimately where it comes from, which is that, and therefore the biblical teaching, or the Jesus' teaching on marriage, is because a man and a woman cleave to each other and become one flesh, therefore that is what marriage is, and it must therefore be sexed, because in the beginning God created a male and a female, and Jesus refers to this, Paul refers to it, and so on. The problem is, back to our use of science, no, he didn't. So it's quite clear, I mean, so firstly, we go back to Genesis and we use Genesis in a mythical form, or as a creation myth. Most of the time, that's the sort of normative, central idea that the church uses Genesis now. But yet, when we talk about sexuality and sex, suddenly it becomes literal again, which I think is a fascinating way of being disingenuous. So that's one kind of answer to that question. Well, is it literal or is it figurative? Is it mythical or is it literal? Secondly, we know that people exist who are intersex. And now, I've been lecturing human reproductive science, supervising it for years, and I still can't say this word, so let me try it. So you have two forms of hermaphroditism. You have primary hermaphroditism and secondary hermaphroditism. And primary hermaphroditism would be where you have a mixture of different sex organs. And secondary, now I've lost the word. And one of you go on, one of you can try and say hermaphroditism. Well, so if you've got primary hermaphroditism, you have a genuine mixture of different sex organs. So you may have some ovarian tissue and some testicular tissue, and if you have secondary hermaphroditism, then you might have different. You might look female from an anatomical perspective, but you might have male genetics, for example. That's just a fact of life. So people are not just made male and female. And as we understand more and more about transphobia and the sort of wider acceptance of people who are trans, it becomes far, far more complicated. But if we go back to pure intersex, and I've asked this question again back to my irritating emails, I sent off an email and said, okay, so, what should they do? Who should this person, who's a primary hermaphrodite, who should they marry? Who are they allowed to marry? Oh, well, you can't use exceptions to it. Yes, you can. Because if your theology essentially ignores hermaphrodites, then your theology ignores part of humanity, and your theology is defective. And so for me, a key thing is to keep bringing back to what is. What do we mean when we say God created the male and female? Well, we know that we have hermaphroditism. What does that say to our understanding of God created the male and female? I think it says something. Over and above knowing everything about trans folk and the changes in brain tissue and the rest of it, if we go right the way back to primary and secondary hermaphroditism, what does that say? And I think it can either say, well, your theology falls apart, your theology is useless, or do some more work and come back later, which was, again, one of my most common university phrases. So what do we mean when we talk about God created them? Why do we talk about it literally in some circumstances and figuratively in others? And who's doing the cherry picking? So, I said I'd talk a little bit about where the church is at the moment, and I think I'll move on to that now. So, the Church of England has, as I say, had a pretty difficult history with LGBT folk and continues to call them issues. So the key document that we're all entitled to engage in is Issues in Human Sexuality. And Issues in Human Sexuality is a deeply flawed and unimpressive document written in the beginning of the 1990s, yes, the 1990s. I was just born, I was 2 years old, when Issues in Human Sexuality hit the press. What a marvel it must have been. And Issues in Human Sexuality has some deeply disturbing stuff in it. There's been some questions asked at General Synod if you want to go and, if you've got too much free time, go and have a look at questions from General Synod about issues in human sexuality. But I might just read a little bit from Issues in Human Sexuality, because I've quoted it in my book, which is embarrassing to me. Incidentally, you cannot get a copy of Issues in Human Sexuality from the Church of England website now. All you can get is an old PDF, which I presume means that they don't want it to be searchable, but I don't know. So, where does it say? It says, I think it was in page 137. Issues in Human Sexuality says this. No, it doesn't. That's not where Issues is. Oh, there I was thinking I had my wonderful notes ready. Sorry. Oh, there it is. I was right the first time. This is how Issues in Human Sexuality starts. And forgive me, it's a long quote, but it's worth it. Homophile orientation, sick. Unfortunately, homophile was a word which I think the bishops of the Church of England thought would catch on. It didn't. Homophile orientation and its expression in sexual activity do not constitute a parallel and alternative form of human sexuality, as complete within the terms of the created order as the heterosexual. The convergence of scripture, tradition, and reasoned reflection on experience, even including the newly sympathetic and perceptive thinking of our own day, make it impossible for the Church to come with integrity to any other conclusion. Heterosexuality and homosexuality are not equally congruous with the observed order of creation or with the insights of revelation as the Church engages with these. We're aware that some regard such a position as tantamount to a rejection of the homophile as a person. Personal identity, it is argued, is so fundamentally bound up with sexuality that to categorise the latter as in some way imperfect is to treat the whole person as also essentially inferior. The argument is, however, false. Sexuality is a very important and influential element in our human makeup, but it is only one aspect of it. Our sexuality may vary from the norm in many ways, of which a homophile orientation is but one, without affecting our equal worth and dignity as human beings, which rests on the fact that all of us alike are made in the image of God. It's crucial to stress this point, because by equating the principles set out in the preceding paragraph, i.e. that homophile orientation is inferior, with an inhuman rejection of the homophile person, great harm has been done. Sexuality is given an inflated significance in human life. Homophiles are wrongly made to feel devalued by the tradition of the Church, and those who hold to that teaching and press to abandon it by implied accusations of cruelty and injustice. So ends the beautiful preface to Issues in Human Sexuality. Now there's a lot to unpack there. But there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the key things is, yes, absolutely, if you're a straight man. Yes, absolutely, sexuality can be part and parcel of your identity, but not central to it and the rest of it. If you're coming to this from a place where you are the norm, and in the House of Bishops in 1990, you were the norm, I presume. But certainly, that was the stated position. So, yes, it's very nice to be gentle and welcoming and the rest of it, but it's very, very challenging to get beyond your own, and I use this word which is contested, but your own privilege as a straight man writing something like that, because it's very difficult to understand what it might feel like if you weren't the norm, and your sexuality is not only being ignored, but also being told to ultimately be an inferior form of living than that of a heterosexual. This remains the current teaching of the Church of England. So I want to come to you with hope, but just to be real, that remains the current teaching of the Church of England. And throughout the second section of the book, I've tried to engage a little bit with how the Church of England's current refusal to engage with reality has led to erasure, to repression and to power gains, rather than to the alternative which I've given as being vulnerability, openness and expression. And I've tried to engage with that from the personal in the first instance, so the impact of repression on individuals, then fed on from the impact of repression on individuals to the erasure that church communities feel more widely. And I think key to that is the conversation about Church of England bishops. Now, I try not to be mean about Church of England bishops because I think they do have a tough old job. However, it would be nice if one of them said something every so often. And the reason I say that is because for the last 30 years, pretty much, there's always been a reason not to say anything on the sexuality issue. There's been another listening process. There's been the shared conversations. There's been preparing for the Pilling Report. There's been preparing for the statement to Synod. There's been the Living in Love and Faith project. For me, it's now time for the bishops to say something. But we also need to ask why they felt unable to say something. And that for me is really key. And that, I think, touches on the erasure point. There are members of the House of Bishops who are gay. We know that there are members of the House of Bishops that are gay. I'm not doing a great reveal, but there are members of the House of Bishops who are gay. It's no surprise to anybody. In a group of that size, there will be one or two, probably a few more. But none of them will say so. The only one who was outed, the Bishop of Grantham, was outed, or was about to be outed by a newspaper and then stated himself that he was indeed gay and had a partner. How many of the other gay bishops in the House of Bishops stood up and said, we support him, we stand in solidarity with him? The answer is extremely simple: 0. Not a single other bishop, knowing that one of their other colleagues was about to be outed, and also being gay, was able, through whatever reason, to stand up and admit to being gay themselves, or to stand in solidarity with that person. If you're looking for sickness at the heart of an institution, there it is. They're not saying that they're having sex. They're not saying that they're living outside the rules of the Church of England. It would simply to have admitted that they are in some way the same as another one of their colleagues. It's a scandal, an absolute scandal, and remains a scandal. And the problem is that the fear interlaces itself through the way that the Church of England behaves. I talk a little bit about the reasons for that fear, but so often the fear is of financial ruin, the fear is of being hounded out of jobs, the fear is of losing status, and the fear ultimately is of losing the unity of the Church. And perhaps we can talk about that a bit in the discussion. But the problem is, if we won't talk about sexuality, if we won't actually talk about sex as Christians, there's plenty of stuff about sex in many ways in the early fathers and in the church, in the Bible and so on. There's plenty. Sex is a fact of life. It happens, you know. If we don't talk about it, if we're scared to talk about it, if we're scared to talk about what it does when we don't talk about it and what the impact on culture and our church culture is, then we end up in a very dangerous place. And I'm hoping I've unpacked a little bit of that in this book. I think it feeds in to the questions around the abuse that we've seen in the church. I'm not, with wanting to put a huge asterisk and disclaimer, that I'm not saying that because we have homosexual priests, we have abuse in the church. I've heard that argument again enough times to be beyond disgusted and bored with it. It's made frequently. I think if you have a culture whereby all of this is wink, wink, nudge, nudge, hide, hide, don't say a word, then bad stuff can get through the cracks. Very bad stuff can get through the cracks. And it's not me saying that. Read every report about the Church of England's abuse. Look at the ICSA report, for example. I quoted it at length in this book. It's there. If we don't talk about this stuff, if we have to refer to people as lodgers, or if we don't want to talk about sex because it might be a bit awkward, and so on, we produce an unhealthy culture, and an unhealthy culture leads to a very, very bad place in a number of situations where there are people wanting to make it lead there. So, to conclude, where are we going as a church? Vicky is actually a member of General Synod, so maybe she should do the section. But I'm going to kind of try and give you an idea as to where I think we're going to go. I think we finally got to the place where this won't hold any longer. I don't think that's just me being optimistic. I think that's probably the case. We are saying to ordinands, to new ordinands who join the church, you must sign up to a document written in 1991 or published in 1991 that talks about homophiles. I mean, it's ridiculous. So that's our first, and we still have to sign up to it, by the way. We're still expected to say, I will abide by the guidelines as given in Issues into Human Sexuality, unless you have a DDO who's willing not to ask you that question, which, by the way, they are meant to ask you. So we're going to have trouble recruiting people, because people, particularly of my generation, but of all generations, in fact, people of my generation and below, in fact, probably a bit younger than me, it's just normal. Same-sex marriage was what happened. Like, they haven't been in a scenario where there wasn't same-sex marriage. It's never been culturally surprising. It's just been back to, taking things as they are rather than as we wish they were. It's just been. Same-sex marriage is a reality. So if you then enter the church, and you enter the same-sex marriage beforehand, and then you feel a call to ordination, the church says no. The church will not ordain you. Full stop. Or, and I believe this is the case, you could opt for a divorce. So, Henry VIII started the game off, and here we are in 2022. And of course, that's a terrible analogy, but it's nonetheless one that gets a cheap laugh. But that's what we ask, that's what we say to people. I think that's pretty scandalous. So we cannot ordain people being same-sex marriage. But not just that. People in the pews are now used to the environment in which same-sex relationships are normal. They've got kids who are gay, or even they've got parents who are gay, they've got brothers and sisters, they've got cousins, they've got godchildren. It doesn't matter. They're coming out. And then they suddenly realise that the church that they're in says, no thanks. Or rather, yes, but. And back to our hospitality question, is yes, but a true form of hospitality for people in that kind of situation? So, it's a missional catastrophe, as much as churches that are generally full of young people may have a more conservative bent, and we hear this time and time again. There is no decent evidence whatsoever. You'll hear this argument, and I just want to nail this one out. You'll hear the argument, the biggest churches are the conservative ones. They're the ones that are getting kids in, therefore same-sex marriage opposition is getting the kids in. Again, quite a challenging logical display. But also there's no evidence. There's anecdote, but there's no evidence. And why is there no evidence? Because who is going to allow that research to be done? So that's a serious point to think about when people make that assertion. Show me the evidence. Number one. So it's a missional catastrophe, I think, if we don't make some kind of move. A particularly good example of that was where the same-sex spouses of bishops were excluded from the Lambeth Conference. In those exact words, on the Lambeth Conference website, the meeting of bishops for the entire Anglican Communion, apart from those who didn't want to come, all the spouses were involved, except same-sex spouses. And on the website it said, all bishops and spouses, open brackets, excluding same-sex spouses, close brackets. And I thought, there you go, you've done it by mistake, but it's marvellous. You've signed exactly what you're doing, which is excluding same-sex spouses. Of course, the University of Kent, which was hosting the event, presumably had a minor breakdown when they saw that they had just admitted a conference to come which specifically excluded same-sex spouses. Now, I think legally it was permitted because it's a faith group or something. I can't remember the exact rules, and someone else who's a lawyer will know much more than me, but it was permitted. But it didn't look great for the University of Kent, who then invited all the same-sex spouses themselves, gave them free accommodation, gave them lovely hampers of wine and things, marvellous. It's worth being a bishop's spouse just for that, isn't it? No, it's not actually. But you know, you were invited. Oh gosh, let's die. I've talked too long. Shall I just take that? Thanks. So, is that working? No. Yes. Yeah, it's working. So I'll finish because that's clearly a sign. Thank you very much, whoever it was. But that was a terrible PR disaster, the exclusion of same-sex spouses. It looked terrible. And we do not have the arguments to back it up. The arguments which we put forward to the world about this stuff do not add up. They're not convincing. And we need to ask ourselves why they're not convincing. Now, some might say, well, they're still right. It's just the world isn't ready to listen. I'm not so sure. Can we really say that those bishops and their spouses, some of whom have children, do not show the fruits of the Spirit which St. Paul talks about? That, for me, is one of the big questions. Look at same-sex marriage. Look at people in same-sex marriages or in same-sex relationships. Are there no fruits of the Spirit there? That's what we're being told we should be saying. I just can't. I can't look at those relationships and say that. So, I think that was a very big own goal, and I think it's a missional disaster, and I think there are challenges with people coming forward for ordination or even joining the church in the first place. I was going to say something else about Lambeth and the weaponising of the Global South, but I might leave that, but I'd be up for discussing that if people wanted to pursue that any further in the questions. But it's worth being aware that there is an Anglican position, which is the Lambeth Conference, which is, by the way, non-binding, and there's a Church of England position. So to return to the point, what's going to happen? Well, Vicky might correct me, but I don't think there's any serious likelihood of the Church of England's General Synod permitting authorised liturgy for the blessing of same-sex marriage. But what we saw at Lambeth, despite the completely catastrophic and self-induced disaster of the beginning of the Lambeth Conference, where a reference to a previous resolution was included entirely unnecessarily, at the end of the Lambeth Conference, we left with an Archbishop saying, this Lambeth Conference, or rather, the Anglican Church has a plurality of views, each of which has been come to after reflection, and no one is coming to them lightly or throwing the Bible out. That's, despite it sounding a little mealy-mouthed, quite remarkable for the Anglican Church. That's where the Anglican Church is. I think that's where the Church of England is going to come to. And at that stage, I think we get to the point where we can no longer say no more same-sex relationships. We cannot say, we cannot bless if we accept that people have come to this from a place of genuine biblical inquiry and are in the numbers that are willing to do it. So, bishops meet in September. It will be fascinating to see what happens next year. And I'd be very interested to hear what you all think about the way forward. But it's been really lovely to speak to you this evening. I apologise for wearing the microphone out. That's a new one for me. I'm very happy to either take questions or just have a discussion. I don't need to answer every question or every point that's made. So thank you very much for listening. Oh my goodness, okay. That you manage that. Otherwise it will be very chaos.
Awkward with them.
One thing that was interesting at the Lambeth Conference is there was 2 petitions made, and one was to support Resolution 110, which is the anti-gay one, and then there was a pro-gay one, to put it bluntly. And the bishops were all asked to sign. The bishops were all asked to sign one of these, and it was something that was not part of the regular structure of the thing. It was something off to one side. And everyone said that Resolution 110 was what the majority believed. And 75% of the Anglican communion believes this, that marriage is just between a man and a woman. And that's what was being spouted out. And by the end of the conference, the pro-gay petition had got 1.5 times the number of signatures as the anti-gay one. So it turns out it's not. It doesn't make it up 75% of the Anglican communion. So, like Charlie was saying, show us the proof. He's saying this is what we all believe, but it's no longer what we all believe. So, I have hope for February when we all get to vote on what the bishops have come back with. And if they don't come back with anything good, we'll kick them out again. So we've got a question for Charlie. something they want to talk about, to ask him.
Oh, do I have to speak in a moment?
It's easier.
Yeah, I want to know why the Church of Scotland has come to a different point of view and the Church of Wales has come to a different point of view and come so far, much further forward.
Yeah, I mean, so, is that, yeah.
You want to go?
Great question. So yeah, both the Church of Scotland and the Episcopal Church in Scotland, because of course the Church of Scotland is, I'm only saying that because I'm a Presbyterian by background, which no one would believe now, judging by my Sunday morning performance, but yes, the Church of Scotland being a Presbyterian established church, but also the Episcopal Church in Scotland, and as you say, Wales is kind of sort of kicking and screaming a bit, but actually beautifully, the speech by the Bishop of St Asaph is just worth reading in its entirety by Bishop, I can't remember his name now, oh, terrible at me. Anyway, it's worth reading the Bishop of St Asaph's speech about how the Church in Wales wants to keep everyone in the tent, but not at the expense of LGBTQI people. We want to keep unity, but not using LGBTQI people as the thing that we're willing to leave. And that for me is that is just the exact centrality of the issue. I think history is part of the reason. So I think the kind of development of the Episcopal Church of Scotland, which of course is why, well, of course the American Church came out of the Episcopal Church of Scotland rather than out of the Church of England, so the Episcopal Church in America. So hence there are different strands of theological thinking that have been going on in those churches. Both Wales and Scotland are non-established, so Scotland is non-established and Wales is disestablished. I think that's right. Someone will correct me, of course, but I think that's right. So there's a slightly different role that those churches are playing, possibly. And one of the things people say about the Church of England, and I'm not being unfair because it's a phrase that's used even at synod sometimes, is that the Church of England is a great boat to fish from. I.e., the Church of England is a fantastic resource for people who don't necessarily share its theology or its history to use to gain new disciples. Now, you can read that in many different ways. But there may be an element of that going on. And I also think the history of the Church of England, so I'm picking up my book this evening, but if you want another cracking book to read, have a read of Jeremy Morris's A History of the Church of England. It's really super. It's quite an easy read. It's not sort of full of footnotes and things, and it's quite long, but it's really good. And it gives you such a good introduction to the hugely challenging and different threads of kind of historical involvement of different camps and groups within the Church of England. And I think helps to explain how we are where we are today, because you're not just dealing with the Anglican Church as though it's a kind of group. You're dealing with like 5 or 6 different threads of theology and groupings that sit throughout Anglicanism, some of whom get thrown out here, some of whom rejoin the tent here, and so on. And I think that probably lies behind why we are further behind, because we're the established church, than Wales and Scotland. That said, I don't think that's an inevitable end of story. I don't think that and I think actually establishment might play into our benefit. But at the moment, I think it's probably because we've got such a diverse, stranded church, and any established church run by canon is going to be inherently conservative in terms of changes to doctrine and dogma, I think, whereas other churches might have a bit more flexibility to try things or do things differently. Uh-oh, I see Hugh's hand up. This usually means bad news.
Charlie, thank you very much for setting out your case with every bit of the clarity and concision which you showed in your briefing for the Health and Social Care Committee over that year. I want to throw back at you your question of what's going to happen next, or what might happen next. And in particular, I want to do so in the context of the point which you made, particularly you haven't made tonight, but you made a point of in your book of saying, I might be wrong. And I want to ask you what the implications of that are and how that could play out in where the Church of England might go from here.
you're quite right, I did say that in the book, and I should have said that tonight, because I actually think that's one of the key things which theology demands of us, is for us to say that we might be wrong. And I don't think there are many pro-affirming people who would completely deny the possibility that they're wrong. I think most pro-affirming people would say we might think we've got this right, but there might just be a very small possibility we've got this wrong. The thing which I've noticed a lot from people who are absolutely sure they're right is that there's no chance they're wrong whatsoever. And so it gets a bit weak, because then you start saying, well, I might be wrong, or you might say, see, you don't know what you're talking about, it's all built on sand, blooming liberals. And so that's always a risk. But I think it's really important to say that. I think, to return to the kind of substance of your question, I think one of the things which was said a lot when this all became, particularly in the secular sphere, but also in the sacred sphere, was that same-sex marriage would be a catastrophe, would lead to the end of marriage, and would destroy heterosexual relationships and various things. This was all said in your own workplace, indeed, which was sort of mildly offensive, but also a bit absurd. But it was said, and it was said in good conscience, allegedly. And we're hearing the same things now, that same-sex marriage will actually destroy the church, and God will punish the church, and, we have to be a holy, there was a lot of talk of holy remnants within the Anglican Communion. And a lot of people then point to things like the Episcopal Church in the United States and say, look, their demographics are dropping, or Wales, the church in Wales has got very few members, and there's a particularly unpleasant commentator whose name I'll leave out, but who keeps saying, well, the church in Wales is dying anyway, who cares? Build up the saints, as Ephesians would say. So those arguments are made, which is that ultimately when you embrace same-sex marriage, then the church dies. So in a sense, an answer to your question is, let's see. Let's see what happens. So I don't think there's any likelihood, or indeed really wish, within the Church of England to force clergy to marry people of the same sex. I don't think there's any likelihood or wish to do that. So, in a sense, can we live together in a church where we do bless people of the same sex? Can we start to learn things from one another, whether we approve of it, we don't know, we don't approve of it, and the rest of it? Can we see the Spirit of God at work in what's going on? For me, yes, we can. For me, looking at churches that have embraced same-sex marriage, you see wonderful and open cultures. So the Episcopal Church has many, many problems, as do we. At the Episcopal Church in America, when I had wine and pizza with the Bishop of Colorado a couple of weeks ago, a slightly bizarre evening, and she was just extraordinary, and you get a sort of image of the Episcopal Church as sort of, there's this terribly mean cartoon which says, a bishop of the Episcopal Church has been sacked for admitting to believing in God, it's sort of, and it's a bit of a tarred-up trope, but it still sits there. She was one of the most honest, spirit-filled, encouraging, missional people I've ever heard, without doubt. But partly, at least, because for her, talking about LGBTQI people was not about talking about others. It wasn't about this issue that we're dealing with. She would just talk about her clergy who were married, and suddenly you realise that actually it was no longer an issue in her context. It was just simply part of the norm. And there hasn't been a great fallout or fall-off in those kind of circumstances. There have been fall-downs in numbers, but were they going to happen because of same-sex marriage, or were they going to be happening because of other things? So I think one of the things we really, really need to do is, like you taught me, is to look at what the causes of these things are, and to look at the statistics properly, to think, what can we truly say logically and rationally from what's being presented to us, rather than always seeking for the next, or for reasons which suit us. So lots of us would like to say, if we have same-sex marriage, our congregations will swell, and the mission of the Church of England will suddenly become... I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen partly because I think we're irrelevant. And I think partly we're irrelevant because people have come to, not all people, but some people come to church and be told they're not welcome and the rest of it, but there's a whole host of reasons we're not hitting the mark at the moment. But I don't think the Church of England is going to fall apart if we have same-sex marriage, simply because other churches which have same-sex marriage in a variety of different contexts have not fallen apart. Whether it's a success or not, I think we need to allow to happen, and I think that's what Wales has done quite carefully by enabling but not enforcing same-sex marriage in Wales, and bits of Canada as well. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think we know the answer, but I think that's okay.
It's not really a question. If there's some, so it's really more of a statement. I mean, I suppose I should feel grateful because at least the Church of England's eyes, they actually exist. Because me and Vicky actually went and spoke to a new church in Peterborough who put on an event in Cathedral Square one day, not too long ago, and we went to see whether they were affirming or supportive or at all. And I didn't actually exist. So gay people in their eyes just didn't exist. It wasn't a thing because I obviously don't exist. The fact that I'm gay and a Christian, I think they struggled, and once we explained what gay was, I think they struggled even more. They went to fetch one of the church elders who came over and said, well, we believe in the Bible that they passed the Genesis, you know. Yeah. And that was what they did. They passed the Genesis. And I just said to Vicky, because Vicky was still trying, bless her. And I sort of said to Vicky, stop trying, you know, because you're not going to get the message to them that actually, you know, I exist. Even though I was stood there in front of them before their eyes, saying what I was quite openly. So I suppose in one way I should be thankful that at least I exist enough to be a problem for the Church of England. I like what you said. You said earlier, and I sort of went, and it's like, the only reason I did that was because you said about, you know, Church of England's had a massive problem with LGBTQIA over the years. I see it the other way around. You know, LGBTQIA people have had the problem with the Church of England over the years. And I am sort of a base belief in Jesus. You know, I do call myself a Christian. I attend church sparingly, I'll admit it. And most of the reason is I can't be doing with, you know, being, you know, cast out by a percentage. And it's only, it's getting, I believe it's getting a smaller and smaller percentage of actually church-going people. Because I attended the LLF course with the local churches and actually found out that most people were quite, you know, educated on the subject, reasonable. Some people had got lesbian, gay or trans friends, and actually I didn't really need to. I mean, there were times when I think people learned from me being there, but I didn't need to worry, you know. What gets me is actually those people were already people that knew the issues that LGBT plus, you know, people have, and yet the church is still sort of holding them back. And I find that really odd. And all I see, and I'm sad to say, is a big fear of mine is that the church in general, the Church of England being the main, you know, what I see as the main church, will just become more and more irrelevant because the people on the outside of the church that are looking at it are just going more and more crazy because you're not accepting the way of the world and the facts of the world and the fact that these people exist. You're still sort of going on that old dogma, if you like, of, you know, and I'm actually quite saddened as somebody who believes in, you know, Jesus as Lord. I am quite saddened because I think if Jesus was here today, to be honest, he would be ashamed of them. I'm sorry to say that's my feeling. I think he'd look at the Church of England and go, he'd be like the temples of old. He'd be, why are you doing this? He never cast people aside no matter who they were. He didn't cast prostitutes aside, or, you know, people who were seen as problem people in those days. He didn't. So why are we as a church, and I can't see it, you know, I can't see why the Church can still stand by and not love people? Because that isn't what Jesus taught. And that's me done.
Yeah, I suppose I've just got I have 3 points, but then one of them I forgot, but it might come back to me. 2 points to add. One is very simple, which is that the statistics, back to statistics, do bear out what you're saying, which is that the majority of people in the pews, okay, the statistics are not brilliant, etc., but the most effective statistics we have suggest the people in the pews are, in majority, in favour of same-sex marriage. So I agree that actually the people you're going to meet are basically mostly okay with it. The second thing is, and I remember what the 2 points were, they're related. I don't want to do the Church of England down, but in some parts of the Church of England, we don't exist. And I think it's worth just being clear about that. In some parts of the Church of England, using the word gay would be seen as anti-biblical, and therefore there is no such thing as a gay person. There's such a thing as a same-sex attracted person. And that remains quite common lingo in certain circles, and it's used quite often behind closed doors rather than when they're open, but it's used. And referring to your kind of point of being around, I think one of the things we need to do, one of the things which is changing the way of life in the Church of England and making the church, whatever we mean by that, and the people in the pews and everything else kind of move a bit, is just refusing to go away. And so I remember there's a friend of mine who's a curate in Streatham. He said to me, he was talking to one of his very conservative curate friends, and they said, "Do you know that bloody Charlie Bell?" And he said, "Yeah, I do, yeah. We're friends, actually." He said, "I wish he'd stop going on about the gay issue." And he said that it was great because it finally showed it was actually getting through, that people are getting irritated that gay people and various other people from LGBTQI groupings are actually refusing to shut up. And I've been told 100 times. I remember being in Ely Diocesan Synod. I'm not sure if you were there at the time, Tim, but I remember being at Ely Diocesan Synod, and I gave her to, I don't know, probably fairly outspoken. I was about 23. I think I had more get up and go back then. And I said to them, I can't remember, I gave some sort of talk about why the Pilling report was a complete catastrophe. And at the end, some terribly nicely dressed vicar stood up and said, "I just think people should have warmer hearts and cooler heads." And I thought, I won't tell you what I thought. Actually, very amusingly, another vicar behind me, again, you can probably guess who it might have been, was sitting behind me and said exactly what came into my head at that moment. It was extraordinary, because that's really how this is being seen, because we're still, in many places, being seen as issues. And the LGBT element is still a point of contention, and so people keep saying, "Don't tell me I'm homophobic, don't tell me I'm transphobic." And there is no other part of life where it's up to straight people to tell you when they're being homophobic or not. It's extraordinary. And working in the NHS, okay, you have to justify why you think if there might be homophobic behaviour and so on. It's not, you can't just go around calling random people homophobic. But if someone says something, their first response is not generally, "No, I'm not, how dare you say that?" It's, "Oh, I'm really sorry, what did I say that offended you?" And then you can discuss it. In the church, they're immediately saying, "I'm not homophobic, how dare you say that? It's outrageous to call me homophobic, that's abuse." And that's what you hear at General Synod. So I agree. So I think being there, calling us who we are, and refusing to sort of go away or get lost, as I said in a recent article, refusing to get lost is the key. And I actually think that is part of the reason that things are changing, because we're not going anywhere. I ain't going to a third province, thank you very much. And I don't see many other gay clergy, or lesbian clergy, bisexual, transgender clergy leaving the Church of England in great droves because we're pushed out. We might get really fed up. We might decide we need to do particular things. There might be some form of disobedience, to be honest, and I can see that on the horizon if there is no change coming. I can see there being such a groundswell of anger and frustration amongst clergy of all different sexualities and genders. I can see all of that happening, but I don't think we're going to go anywhere. And it's odd, and people can't understand what on earth we're saying. And I can understand why gay folk who are not part of the church look at the church like, "Nope," and then off they go. They'd rather go to the, I don't know what the people, I don't know what normal people do on Sunday mornings. But they might rather go to the rugby or something, I don't know, I'm not sure if that's the most stereotypical description. But anyway, they might go off to do their own thing. Why would they come in the door? But those of us who are in the door, and particularly those of us who are wearing a collar, and who are willing to take some of this heat, some of us need to take the heat. But that's no reason to say to people, you have to stay if you feel like you can't take it anymore. And it's that really difficult balance between keeping people in the door, but not making LGBT folk take all the fire, and that's why allyship is so important. Allyship is usually the reason that change happens in a whole host of different historical examples. So that's why allyship is so key, I think.
So this is just a kind of reflection on historical point of view being variations, and that in the 1980s we were having these discussions about whether women could be deacons in the Church of England, then we had the discussion about whether women could be priests, and then we had the discussion about whether women could be bishops, and we had discussions about whether divorced people could be remarried in church, and whether divorced people could therefore become priests and deacons. And we've gone through this endlessly weary and exhausting series of kind of attritional battles, which have finally seen all those things come to reality. So on the positive side, I'm thinking, yeah, you're right, probably just keep at it, and we will eventually get to a position of sanity and inclusiveness. And by the way, the link you made with disability, the church will not be the body of Christ, a whole and full and rich and place where we find the fullness of life until all are included. So that's what we've got to do. I'm just wondering whether this is a sort of visceral last stand from some people, whose understanding of the Bible, basically as a book, as a script, is just so flawed. We have some point to get to the point where we actually understand the Bible isn't some, as it were, inscribed on a tablet of stone literally by God at some point. One book, one text, shaped at one moment in history, and therefore it lands on your desk, and therefore you've got to live with it. It is, as you were rightly saying, a whole series of texts and, types of writing and emerging from all sorts of contexts, all of that sort of stuff. And it seems to be the fundamental difference, really, actually, here is not about sexuality or anything else. It's about actually whether we can really grow up enough to actually understand what the Bible is at all. But I'm hopeful that we will. I'm hopeful that at least we can get to the kind of, living together in, not in faith and love, but living together with difference and honesty. And I hope I get there. That's my prayer. Anyway, that's just a fairly random series of reflections.
But isn't that, I think that is what we, I agree. Isn't that what we've got to do? And I think we learn, so back to this sort of thing of what do we do if people don't agree and so on. I actually think that although living in love and faith has been pretty depressing at times, in a sense, it's been quite good for people to actually have to form their own position in a way which they have to defend. And having to defend your position makes you challenge your position, even if you don't, in the majority of cases, not in all cases, there are plenty of exceptions, but they're in the majority of cases actually challenging your own position and thinking, well, can I defend what I'm saying, and so on. I think that's key to, actually key to Anglicanism, but I think it's key to forming a mature faith. I think I agree with you that this is like the biblicist's last stand. I agree. Because the anger and the frustration and the rudeness, to be honest, and the rest of it, and I can occasionally be forthright, but there's such rudeness, such anger and really vileness when the Archbishop of Canterbury said that two positions had been, or there are a variety of positions which had been come to through deep biblical reflection, and that no one was throwing the Bible out. The violence that was met with by certain folk in the team, in the group that who don't believe that same-sex marriage should happen, was extraordinary. Really extraordinary, and it felt like that kind of last stand. How dare you say these things are equal, or even that you mention that there are two things. And I think that for me is, in a sense, a sign of hope, a sign that we might be getting there, a sign that we might take the Bible on its own terms. So when you say you don't believe in the Bible, you kind of think, well, I don't think you're showing the Bible much cop, really, if you're just treating it as a text that it's not claiming to be itself. The Bible interprets itself. And if you're not able to use the Bible to interpret itself, then what are you doing? So I think there is but I think you're right. I think ultimately we have to move beyond the indefensible. But I don't think that necessarily we're going to do that immediately. and part of that's going to be a kind of learning process over the next X number of years. But yeah, I think we're there. I hope we are. I don't want to spend the rest of my ministry talking about this. So this is perfectly good. Like, it was great fun to write, and well, it wasn't that much fun, was it really? But it was fun enough to write, and I really enjoyed getting everything into one place. It was really cathartic. But this is not like it's important. It's important, and it's key in a way to understanding how we think about human nature. And there are so many insights from LGBTQI people in the way that the church is engaged with them that feed into our wider understanding of theology. But do I preach about gay issues every Sunday at St John the Divine, Kennington? Goodness me, no. Why? Because, firstly, in our parish, it's not that key. You know, people are mostly on board, and also we can talk about it over coffee or usually rum. We can have conversations about these things. But also because in my parish, or in the parish which I'm serving in, our population is our parish congregation is probably about 80% non-white, possibly higher than that. For us in Kennington, the much bigger issue is racism. Much, much bigger. And so why would I spend my time talking about something which we don't need to spend a lot of time talking about when we've got these issues on the doorstep whereby the church can make a positive impact? And the sad thing is, at the moment, the church cannot make a positive impact in the same way in the lives of LGBTQI people because we're still having our internal fights. It's always qualified. It's never absolute. And so, I can't wait to not talk about this stuff anymore. Really. And I'm sure some of the people on the other side of the debate from me cannot wait for me to stop talking about it too.
Charlie, could you elaborate on it? You mentioned, I think it was allyship a little while ago. Could you tell us a bit more about what you mean and why you're so hopeful?
Yeah, see, what I mean really is that people who are not themselves gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, why it's important for them to do some of the heavy lifting that LGBT folk have spent their lives doing. So whenever I go into a parish, I went to a load of ordinations this year, which were all thrilling, and when I went to each of them, they're all very long, and you go in, and there are clergy in there who see me, know I've written this book, or know that I'm outspoken on this issue, and will not speak to me, who will turn the other way, and I'm pretty hard, and I don't really care, with the nicest possible sense, I really don't. But when that happens every time, and whenever you go to a church, then you're immediately labelled as the person who says this about sexuality, or the gay priest from down the road. It gets to you eventually, and it definitely gets to lots of LGBT people. It gets to them in the pews as well, people who are in the pews who don't have people to kind of necessarily have the institutional power and authority that some of us have. So for me, that's why it's really important for people who are not LGBT to stand up on these issues and not see it as a side issue, but see it as part and parcel of their Christian citizenship, their citizenship of the kingdom of heaven. And actually, allyship, if we want to, it's not good enough, for example, another example from the parish I'm in, it's not enough for our Black Lives Matter events, or our events that relate to racism in the local area, to be entirely staffed by, funded by, and attended by black people. It's ridiculous. Because it just yet again forces people who are themselves the victim of oppression to then be the people that have to turn up and do the work on the day. Now that's not the same as saying that then a load of white people should come in and say, well, we think we should do the following things. But it's about working out how you support in an effective way people who are themselves often the target of the oppression or the structural oppression or whatever that it is that's affecting them. And I think in churches, from an LGBT perspective, clergy, in synod, and this is happening often, laity in synod, laity in the pews, clergy in the pulpit and so on, speaking about this and turning it into not a side issue, not into something only the LGBT people care about, but actually being, and it not being a surprise when a straight cleric says something positive about LGBT people. That for me would be great, and I think the next place for that kind of allyship might be the House of Bishops. And there are plenty of bishops who are self-professed, not straight, sorry, they're not, self-professed straight, who could be doing that kind of effective allyship. And I hope at the end of Living in Love and Faith we might see some more of that. People who are willing to stand up for others and with others, not to take limelight, as it were, from them, but to take the pressure off them. And I think that's how we move forward.
What you're describing there is the body of Christ, isn't it?
Exactly.
That we all stand together and support one another, so that when one part of the body is being wounded or is being attacked, the other parts of the body support that and stand together. And I think, picking up again what Chris was saying, that recognition that we need each other in this. There's just so much I want to kind of come back and pick up on, and probably just can't. It's too late. We've all been here too long, and I've had a very busy day dealing with dinosaurs. And my goodness, don't mention that. It's a fundamentalist. But I mean, we're sitting here in a church that has a creation trail around it, and it's been quite interesting that when this has been mentioned and spoken about, that so many people have said to me, oh, so how does a person of faith then think about science and evolution and all of that? And for myself, I was a zoologist before I ended up going into the church, animal behaviour and so on and so forth. But it struck me, going right back to the beginning of your talk tonight, and this whole thing of using our intelligence, using our God-given brains and understanding that is emerging and developing all the time about the world around us. Theology was the queen of sciences. That's how science evolved in the first place, because people wanted to understand more about God, the Creator, through studying the creation. And we seem to so often just move so far away from all of this. When it comes to biblical fundamentalism, the literal or the figurative, we just, and all of us, even if we know better, as it were, still get boxed back into those terrible corners, by people who bash us over the head, with the Bible. And so I think there's something about trying to go back to what we know, as you said, what is fact, and maybe this is something that all of us could do better in terms of equipping ourselves, if you like, with the information that we need in these debates, in these discussions and conversations. But there is also something here about trying to sort of engage the whole of our humanity, our brain, our history, our experience, and this is for everything in the church, isn't it? Actually, that we so often just become infantile again, and let go, of so much that we should bring into the life of faith, and that goes into every area of our lives. So much of what you've said, I think, is experienced and has been recognised, by any exclusion that is going on by any group of people who are being marginalised or seen as being less worthy than any other. And that is a scandal. It's an utter outrage, because it's anti-God. It's heretical, actually. And we need to sort of have the courage to sort of stand up and say these things. And I'm wittering now, but I feel so passionately about this, and you've really, really, I think, given me so much to think about and inspire us, and so much work to do, that is for sure. But God will show us the way. We just need to stop being so afraid and speak out a bit more clearly and have the conversations. And I think that's where living in love and faith perhaps was most effective and affective, actually, is that it brought people together in conversation and began to sort of grow some trust and understanding and sense of being the body of Christ again, to come back to where I started, and now I'll shut up. But thank you so much.
Vicky, what do you want? Do you want one more question, and then should we draw it to a close?
Yeah, have we got another question?
If there is one. It's always dangerous to say that when there isn't one.
Wants to do a little run? Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk and for sort of bringing up some really clear points. For instance, LGBTQ Christians who are, maybe a little bit less sure of where they stand, maybe they feel intention within themselves, and maybe they kind of have a situation where they might have a church of people who are saying, I don't know why you're so bothered about, what the church is saying, and they might be in an environment in the church where they feel like they can't actually be open to about who they are. Do you sort of have any advice for those people?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? Because back to a point that's made earlier, the kind of is it the church has got a problem with LGBTQI people, or LGBTQI people have got a problem with the church, and in the end, it's very difficult in the world as it is now to have, particularly as someone with faith who also is LGBTQ, to start to have those conversations. Who do you start to have those conversations with? Because if you have those conversations with people in the secular world, people will generally kind of be like, well, what on earth are you playing at? Why are you doing that? And in the church, you never know what's safe. I mean, one of the benefits, I'm not being paid to say this, but one of the benefits of the Inclusive Church Network is actually finding people who will be able to have those conversations and might be able to equip you. And so that's, I think, one of the things I would say to anyone in that situation, which is go and find someone. You might not agree with them theologically, and actually that's often the case. We don't agree with each other theologically on a host of different things, from lace to candles to everything. So we might not agree with each other, but getting the question and the conversation started for me seems the key thing, to then give you an insight into, oh, you might want to read this, or this might be a good person to talk to, or this might be a group of people that you can engage with. I think back to the kind of body of Christ comment, for me, one of the things that LGBTQ Christians really miss is the fellowship that a lot of other Christians might share. Because there might only be one or two in the congregation, if that, there might be one that's out and not that. And so in the end, you end up having a very particular understanding and experience of God and of your life as a Christian and as your life as an LGBTQI person, but you don't have the ability to have that fellowship with others, which enables you to grow in that faith. And issues in human sexuality notwithstanding, with all the comments about how sexuality is not everything, it's pretty key. And it becomes more key the more you're told that it shouldn't be talked about, or the more you're told that it's not, that you should be focusing on other things. So I think the Inclusive Church is a good place to start. I think the Church of England needs to listen to that question in a very serious way, because I think it's one of the things which we don't necessarily do well. I don't think we necessarily know or are willing to open doors to people who might want to start that kind of conversation, or might want to continue that conversation with people. And I'd also say that there are things like church groups and so on that people belong to, and different people have different ecclesiologies in their churches that they belong to, and different ecclesiologies will be opposed or in favour or whatever else. If you're in a place that doesn't where you don't feel those conversations are available or possible or effective, you're not letting the side down, speaking to people from a different kind of environment to have those conversations. It doesn't mean that you're going to be like, I'm going to buy everything they say, engage in critical thinking and all the rest of it. But there are places more and more that are willing to fly the flag and say we're willing to have those conversations. And I suppose in a sense, what you've said is a really clear clarion call for the Church of England to recognise that in the wake of Living in Love and Faith, in the wake of the Lambeth Conference, in which lots of negative publicity came out and so on, we need to be places that are able to facilitate those kind of conversations, where people are able to be themselves more and more fully within the church community which they belong to. And I think that's possibly where we should leave it tonight, in terms of that's what we need to become. We need to become a church where people can flourish and be themselves more. And you are yourself more when you're in fellowship with others, and you're in fellowship with others when they recognise you for who you are. Thanks.
Charlie, thank you so much. I'm not going to say anything else now except to just lead us in prayer as we finish together. So let's just take a moment perhaps to reflect, to hold something special that has come out for us tonight. Sorry, that was probably the wrong phrase to use, wasn't it? But something that has perhaps been a gift to us tonight from things that we've heard from Charlie and from one another. So let's just take a moment and then finish with a prayer.
saying the grace.